I'm pleased to introduce Bassem Eid, an independent Jerusalem-based political analyst, human rights pioneer, and expert commentator on Arab and Palestinian affairs. Mr. Eid was born in the Jordanian-occupied Old City of Jerusalem in 1958, and at age 8 was relocated by the Jordanian government to the Shuafat refugee camp run by UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian refugees in the Near East. Today, he divides his time between homes in Jerusalem and Jericho. Bassem Eid rose to prominence during the First Intifada, the Palestinian uprising that raged from 1987 until 1993, during which he served as a senior field researcher for B'Tselem, the Israeli Information Center for Human Rights in the Occupied Territories. He publicly condemned the widespread murder of by the PLO of Palestinian dissidents, often for reasons unrelated to the Intifada. In 1995, following his report about human rights violations committed by the Palestinian Preventive Security Forces, he was arrested by the PA Presidential Guard under Yasser Arafat, but was released 25 hours later following widespread international condemnation. In 1996, he founded the Jerusalem-based Palestinian Human Rights Monitoring Group. He spent 26 years researching UNRWA policies and has written extensively on UNRWA reform. Mr. Eid is also a critic of the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement against Israel. Welcome back to our region, Bassem. Shalom, Ahlan.
Shalom, thank you, Alim.
Bassem, there's a lot of despair about the future of relations between Israel and the Palestinians after so many years of terrorism, concessions, stalled peace plans, rejectionism. With your impressive background that I just presented, can you tell us what future you envision for relations between Israel and the Palestinians in Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, and also in the surrounding Arab states?
I believe that one of the major tragedies of the Palestinian people is their own leadership. The Palestinian leadership would like to keep the current situation as a consensus. They don't want to move a little bit forward. I think that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict almost forgotten by the international. And everybody right now is running after those Arab countries who would like to create normalization with Israel. So the Palestinians are completely in the corner right now, and nobody is scared about them because the Palestinians are not care about themselves. Look, since Bibi Netanyahu has been elected until today, what's happened? Just nothing. Stop building settlements, stop building settlements. While Bibi Netanyahu stopped building settlements for 6 months, I didn't see that the Palestinian leadership tried to move a little bit forward. So we stuck right now nowhere. I think that the future of the Israeli-Palestinian relation almost is stuck somewhere. And unfortunately, I am not looking right now that in the near future, any kind of solution or any kind of peace will take place between the Palestinians and the Israelis. Unfortunately, the Palestinian leadership today looking to the United Arab Emirates, to the Kingdom of Bahrain as an Israeli spies. Why? Because these people, their leadership has been so wise, and they found that normalization with Israel will only benefit the United Arab Emirates and the Kingdom of Bahrain, no more and no less. I think that that's a huge step forward from the Kingdom of Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates. And I think that the Palestinian Authority right now must have to understand the lesson that the United Arab Emirates and the Bahrain almost put it on the table. I think that the word almost changed. Unfortunately, we have a so old leadership who like only to talk about the past, who like only to mention history. They are not looking to the future of their people and the children's of their people.
So, Bassem, I want to follow up. You spoke now about your own vision, but how is it seen among the average Palestinian in the territories? What is their view? What can you tell us about that?
See, Alan, Palestinian people are careless about anything. Why? Because the Palestinian people almost lost the trust in their own leadership. Nobody is care about the situation. If you will come today to any ordinary Palestinian and asking him, what are the most three priorities that you are seeking? He will say a job to survive, to ensure the medical system and the education system for my children. Nobody is talking about settlements. Nobody is talking about the wall. Nobody even talking about the foundation of the Palestinian state, which means that these people almost became so frustrated from their own leadership. And I'm not talking here about the West Bank. I am talking also about the Gaza, because the Hamas in Gaza are also an organization who are terrorizing their own people in Gaza. The Hamas is trying to keep 2 million innocent people in Gaza as hostages to implement the Iranian policy and the Iranian strategy in the Middle East. Unfortunately, sometimes I am coming to my Palestinian colleagues, especially in the refugee camps, and I am trying to explain to them one important thing by saying that homeland is not the place where you born. Homeland is the place where you can find dignity, justice, and freedoms. This is the real homeland. I think that after 54 years under the Israeli authority, I think that the Palestinians start realizing more and more that under the Israelis, much better than it is under any other Arab country around the world. People almost realize that. And people would, you know, when Bibi Netanyahu talked recently about the annexation, I went to the Jordan Valley to some villages which used to be annexed to Israel. And I asked people, what do you think about that? Then people ask me, when that will happen? Please tell us. Please tell us. We are very happy. Because they want to save their lives from the dictatorship that they are living under these days with the blind eyes of the international community.
Well, you actually brought me with that to my next question to you, and that is, what is actually happening in the Palestinian Authority right now? Mahmoud Abbas is in the 15th year of his 4-year term as president. He's ostensibly cut ties with Israel in frustration over the moving of the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem on Israel's 70th birthday. His frustration over the Trump peace plan that was launched in January, and other steps by Israel and the United States. Now, there's no heir apparent to Abbas, and there are no elections in sight. And as you mentioned, Hamas remains controlling in Gaza. So assuming there's no breakthrough with Israel, where do the Palestinian Authority, where does it go from here?
See, I used to say, Alan, that all of the world right now are talking about two-state solution for two people. But the Palestinians are talking about the three-state solution for two people. Why three-state solution? Because you have the Islamic Emirate in the Gaza Strip ruled by the Hamas. You have the empire of the West Bank ruled by Abbas, and the state of Israel. This is how we are living in the past 10 years. We didn't move from that description at all. In my opinion, the international community is not trying even to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Unfortunately, the international community these days became a part of the problem rather than a part of the solution. And I think that Abbas is trying to achieve and to approach his strength, his popularity from the international community and mainly from Europe. I didn't see that Europe trying even to impose any kind of pressure on Abbas, even to make elections, even to improve the human rights record, let's say, in the Palestinian territories. I didn't see that the international community doing anything. And in the meantime, the international community continue giving hundreds of millions of dollars to the Palestinian Authority. So if the international community feeling so comfortable by transferring hundreds of millions of dollars every month and keeping Abbas in power, so don't ever think that Abbas will make peace with Israel. That's the major problem, in my opinion, of the Palestinian people.
So as a follow-up to this, what happens when Abbas eventually leaves the scene? As we mentioned, he's already 85 years old. So what happens? Will there be violence? Will it spill over into Israel, in your opinion?
I must have to tell you that it's not going to be easy, because the Fatah movement right now almost divided to probably 50 different parties and branches. Imagine if Abbas will die tomorrow. The Fatah will start fighting the Fatah in the West Bank. And I used to say that probably if Israel will not involve, a big chaos will take place in the West Bank. Because right now, there is a big fight right now in Balata refugee camp in Nablus. Between whom and whom? Between the Abbas competent, Muhammad Dahlan, who is living in Dubai, and the Palestinian security forces. A huge fight every night. They are firing towards each other in Balata refugee camp since 10 days ago, and no one succeeds to solve is such kind of a small problem. So imagine if things will come out of control, then all of the West Bank start shooting against the West Bank. The Palestinians will start shooting against themselves, and nobody want to interfere here. So it's not going to be easy if Abbas will pass away, and probably that will be one of the major obstacles for Israel to try to keep orders in the West Bank. Everybody in the West Bank, every Fatah member in the West Bank want to be a president tomorrow morning. Everyone want to be a president. And this is how the fight almost started. I don't believe that Abbas has many years to live over here, but very soon we are going to see a huge chaos in the West Bank after the death of Abbas.
And what is the chances that Hamas would come to power in that chaotic situation?
See, I think that the Hamas is still far away from the situation. Why? Because Israel still exists in the West Bank. Israel is there. Hamas couldn't function. at all in the West Bank. And we can see these days in the West Bank, the Hamas became between Abbas Hamar and the Israeli anvil. They couldn't move. They couldn't make any kind of activities in the West Bank. So Hamas is out of the picture here. The major problem is the Fatah itself, and the major fight right now is the Fatah against Fatah.
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to change gears a little bit. And as I mentioned in my introduction, you've dedicated a lot of your career to following UNRWA, which was established, over 70 years ago as a temporary UN agency to facilitate the resettlement of Palestinian refugees following Israel's War of Independence. But many, including the US administration, today see UNRWA as perpetuating the Palestinian problem and fomenting hatred against Israel. Now, you're a 33-year resident of the UNRWA-run refugee camp. You were a resident and a leading researcher of its practices. And I'd like you to tell us at length what you see as the future and what should be the future of that organization.
See, Alan, as you mentioned, I am a person who grown up and developed in a refugee camp called Shafat refugee camp in the north of Jerusalem. I lived over there for 33 years, from 1966 until 1999. And I still have 6 brothers who are still living in that camp, which I have to go, probably once or twice a month to go and to visit them. It is one of the most miserable places that you can ever imagine to live is a refugee camp. UNRWA, in my opinion, they are also keeping the Palestinian refugees as hostages in the refugee camps to benefit itself, which is UNRWA. If you are looking today to the workers of UNRWA, if you will take the directors and the big heads of UNRWA, they bring them from Switzerland, from Italy, from Holland, from Germany, and these people's salary is something like $20,000 a month, beside the rent of the house, beside the office, beside the advisors, beside the car. Now, what we, the Palestinian refugees, benefiting from somebody from France who is getting $20,000 salary a month? What we are benefiting from him? Why we need him? Why not to hire a Palestinian here in $2,000 and to be a director or to be a manager? It is one of the most corrupt organizations in the world is UNRWA. Sometimes people asking me, why UNRWA in the past 70 years, they didn't solve the problem of the Palestinian refugees? I said they didn't solve it for a very simple reason. If UNRWA will solve the problem of the Palestinian refugees, then the 30,000 employees of UNRWA will become refugees and jobless. That's exactly the story of UNRWA. I think that UNRWA, since the Oslo Agreement, is trying more and more to politicize the Palestinian curriculum in the schools. I think that UNRWA these days are teaching hate, violence, and incitement. These are the main 3 topics that UNRWA is teaching these days in the Palestinian schools. Once I went to Jordan to make a film, a short documentary on the schools of UNRWA in Jordan. And I met some students who are 12 and 14 years old. And I said, listen, when you grow up and become a man, what do you wish to do? You know what he told me? I want to explode myself in Jerusalem. I said, what? I want to explode myself in Jerusalem. Why you want to explode yourself? Because I want to liberate the Palestinians from the Israeli occupation. When I asked him, who taught you that? He said, the teachers in the school. After that interview, I went and I interviewed a teacher in the same school. And I said, are you teaching him to explode himself? He said, of course. If he didn't explode himself, how he can liberate his people from the Israeli occupation? This is UNRWA. This is UNRWA. And unfortunately, UNRWA still getting its funding from around of the world. Around of the world. We remember last year when President Trump decided to cut off the funding from UNRWA, which is around $300 million a year. UNRWA succeed to compensate itself in $900 million instead of the $300 million of the Americans. Because everyone want to give, Germany, Japan, Canada, Saudi, Kuwait, everybody want to give money. That's the major problem of the Palestinians. In my opinion, the major two problems of the Palestinians, the first one is UNRWA, the second one is the Palestinian leadership.
Well, let me follow up on, you mentioned the textbooks that,
Yeah.
And I know you've done research on the textbooks. These are Palestinian textbooks that are used in the UNRWA schools.
Yes.
And you've already told us that they foment this hatred of Israel and promote terrorism. But we're told that this message is also being broadcast on Palestinian television and radio and in some of the publications and the newspapers in the Palestinian Authority. Can you relate to that?
You are right, Alan. For the Palestinian media, Israel is not exist. You know, they used after Oslo to call it Israel. You know what they are calling it now? The occupied 48 the occupied 48 land. This is what Israel. When they mentioned, you know, some cities as Tel Aviv, they call Tel Aviv settlement, the Israeli settlement Tel Aviv. Look, Tel Aviv in 1 minute became a settlement, yeah? Look how many years the Israelis worked to build it, and in 1 minute it became a settlement for the Palestinian media. No doubt that that's the message of the Palestinian Authority to the media these days. It tried to incite. It tried to incite. That's the major message that the Palestinian Authority is trying to spread out right now. Look, Alan, when somebody going and stabbing a Jew in Jerusalem, immediately the Palestinian Authority announced about on him as a hero, and immediately his family start getting salary. When you are giving a salary to a stabber, that means that you are trying to encourage the others to do the same. This is encouragement. When you are giving me money, that means that you want all the Palestinian people to be stabbers and to go to the roads and to stab Jews as much as they can. So when the Palestinian Authority is spreading out such kind of messages, no doubt that the media will buy it, the media will obey it, because who is covering the costs of the media in the West Bank? It is the Palestinian Authority. So if we are not going to obey the Palestinian Authority, no salaries will be paid at the end of the month. So let us go head by head, as they said, and to continue implementing its policy in terms to receive the salary at the end of the month, to survive and to let our children survive.
Well, that's a very sorry state of affairs, of course.
Yeah, right, right.
But now, I mentioned earlier that you're an opponent of the BDS movement.
Right.
And that movement seeks to poison international opinion about Israel and ratchet up the pressure against Israel internationally in order to force it into concessions. That's what they believe that the BDS movement will bring about eventually. Now,
Yeah.
as a Palestinian, I wanted to ask you why you're so vocal in your opposition to BDS.
Yeah. See, first of all, I used to say, Alan, in the past, that the members of the BDS used to be a jobless people, and they succeed to find a job for themselves forever. Because the Israeli-Palestinian conflict will never be solved. So it is a job forever. Secondly, what the Palestinians really benefiting from the BDS, which support the BDS is trying to provide to the Palestinians. The BDS want to close the Jewish businesses, let's say, in the West Bank. But when those businesses are closed, the Palestinian workers will be fired. Now, when you will be fired, who is going to look after you? Will the BDS provide any kind of salaries to those fired workers? Will the BDS try to find jobs for those workers who has been kicked out from their work? Just nothing. Just nothing. So the BDS, in my opinion, are just using the Palestinians for their own political agenda. What is the BDS political agenda? It is never ever to bring peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians. The real agenda of the BDS is how to destroy Israel. Because these people are funded by the Iranians, are funded mostly by an Islamic charities around the world. So would Iran allow Israel to exist? Would the Islamic charities allow Israel to exist? So this is the agenda that we will support you under one condition. We want to destroy Israel. We don't want to bring peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians. In the meantime, the BDS called themselves as a human rights organization. Which human rights organizations you are talking about? Alan, I faced a lot of troubles from these people during my lectures in the United States. They attacked me several times. They tried to disturb my lectures over there. These people don't believe that a Palestinian has the right to express himself. They want only the BDS to speak on behalf of the Palestinians, but the Palestinians are not allowed to speak on their own behalf. This is the BDS. So I think that this is one of the most important things that I am doing, how to continue fighting is such horrible organization, which is, in my opinion, are harming the Palestinians much more than they are harming the Israelis.
So what advice can you give us to fight the BDS movement? What practical steps would you suggest?
I
Because we
think
know some businesses were indeed forced out of Judea and Samaria, where there were many hundreds of Palestinians were employed, and now they've lost that employment, as you mentioned.
we have thousands of Palestinians who are working in the settlements around of the West Bank. I think that my messages are very strong. I am a person who is living the situation, and I am only the person who can speak on behalf of the situation. And I think that I can put a lot of pressure when I am appearing in the different campuses in the United States and telling the people what are the situation right now. And this is what makes the BDS so nervous. This is why they are disturbing. This is why they are attacking. This is why they are fighting, because they don't want the truth to come out, especially in the campuses in the United States. Alan, it is something unbelievable. When I am appearing in the campuses in the United States, only in that time, I am feeling the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I never felt it in Jerusalem. I never felt it in Ramallah. Why those people on the campuses are so busy with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? You want to tell me that there is no problems in America? The Americans has nothing to think about, only the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Please forget us. We are, the Israelis and the Palestinians are the only qualified people to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but nobody else from the outside. So my messages are very important. My writings are very important. My interviews against the BDS also very important.
Well, I mean, one thing that, or the one plan actually is to build the peace through the economy, and through greater degree of cooperation between Israelis and Palestinians, exactly the opposite of what the BDS movement is seeking. So what do you think about that? Can we build trust and a future first through economic cooperation, other civil cooperation between the two peoples?
Alan, I am a person who believes that only economic prosperity can pave the way towards peace, not politics. Economic prosperity. And unfortunately, this is what the international community kept a blind eyes on, the economic prosperity. Economy is the most important thing. Each Israeli and Palestinian right now is seeking an economic prosperity. If you will give, it's reminding me, you know, in one of the meetings in the Israeli cabinet, Bogi Ya'alon, who used to be the Minister of Defense, once during the stabbing intifada, let's call it, Bogi Ya'alon told Netanyahu, I want to increase the number of the Palestinian workers in Israel. Then Netanyahu said, now you want to increase it? Just yesterday, there was a big stabbing in a settlement. Then Bogi Ya'alon said, you are right. But I am a person who believes if we will increase the permits of the workers in Israel, that probably will decrease the Palestinian violence. I believe that economic prosperity probably will decrease the Palestinian violence. So that's exactly what I am calling for. Let us start from economy. Look in the past 26 years, 27 years since the Oslo Agreement. How many conferences, how many meetings, how many gatherings between the Israelis and the Palestinians? Anything moved? Just nothing. Because they are talking only politics and they never ever mention the economic prosperity. It is the time for the international community to start realizing that peace will never ever be achieved without an economic prosperity. The economic prosperity is the only method to pave the way towards a future peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians.
Well, that was a major part of the Trump peace plan. Was the first level was to build the economy, which very much is in line with what you're saying. And you know, we mentioned this earlier that Israel has signed these diplomatic accords with 3 additional Muslim countries just in the last few weeks, the UAE, Bahrain, and Sudan. These agreements that were summarily rejected by the Palestinian leadership, who called them treasonous and even used worse language than that.
Yeah.
And you know, when they turned to the Arab League to condemn these agreements, they were rejected by the Arab League. But it seems to me that a major part of those agreements are also in the economic field, that the Palestinians also could have benefited from if they had embraced those agreements.
No doubt, Alan, that the Palestinians will benefit. Listen, if you will look to Israel and the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, they are not enemies. There is no fight between Israel and Bahrain and United Arab Emirates. So why we need to make peace? If you are not my enemy, I am not your enemy, why to make peace? Yeah, we want to make peace for economic reasons. I think that the leadership in the AUE and in the Kingdom of Bahrain start realizing how much they can benefit from the Israeli brain. We have the money, you have the brain. Let us make more money than the money that we got right now. That's exactly the accord. That's exactly the agreement, is how to invest and how to bring for more and more economic prosperity for the both sides. The Israelis will benefit. Imagine when the Israelis will open more and more factories, as an example. Who are the workers? First of all, the Palestinians. First of all, the Palestinians. Building factories in Israel, that will increase the working permits for the Palestinians. You know, sometimes Palestinians became very happy when Israel announced that they are going to build 1,200 houses in the settlement. Imagine, because that's giving a little bit of hope that might be I will get a permit tomorrow morning and will go to another work. You know, the Palestinians loves to work in Israel rather than to work in the Palestinian territories. You know why? Because the average monthly salary in Israel is 8 times than it is in the Palestinian territories. People right now working monthly salary in the Palestinian territories in 1,400 shekels a month. How you can survive in such kind of amount? While in Israel, you can get at least 8,000 shekels a month. That's a big difference. That's exactly the dignity that I am talking about. I think that the majority of the Palestinians these days are people who are seeking dignity rather than identity.
Bassem, I want to stay for a minute on this topic of the accords that were signed. And I mean, clearly this was a realignment of the geopolitical situation in our region, vis-a-vis Iran, vis-a-vis other neighboring countries. And I'd like to ask you what you see as future alignments and realignments that will take place in light of the outbreak of peace between Israel, UAE, Bahrain, Sudan, and perhaps other countries that are in the pipeline for signing of these accords. How will this turbulent situation evolve into the future?
In my opinion, Alan, the Arab leaders and even the Arab nations, by the way, start realizing slowly the influence of the state of Israel in the region. They start realizing slowly the influence of Israel in the region. In my opinion, Israel today is not the same Israel 20 years ago. 20 years ago, Israel was really surrounded by enemies. Today, Israel is not surrounded by enemies. I think that that's probably will bring a very important change. Alan, the terrorist organization called Hezbollah used to receive his military equipment through Sudan. Imagine when Sudan signed a peace accord with Israel, Hezbollah will never ever be able to receive one bullet from Sudan. That's very important. While we are making the circle of peace wider and wider, we are in the meantime making the circle of the terror more and more narrow. And that's exactly the opinion, in my opinion, the thinking right now for the Israelis, for some Arab countries, and for the administration of President Trump. In my opinion, this is something that we will never forget it, that Trump really made a real peace in the Middle East. The real peace in the Middle East is between the Arab countries and Israel. It is not between the Palestinians and the Israelis. The Arab countries are much more important in this moment to make peace with Israel than the Palestinians. The Palestinians at all not important here in the whole, the strategy of the region. There are some Arab countries, especially the Gulf, which is very important. And I am really very optimistic that the new Middle East is on its way. And I wish that Shimon Peres is still alive to see the new Middle East, because he is the first one who talked about the new Middle East.
Well, that's true. That is true. We have a few more minutes, and I'd like to ask if the strained relationship between Israel and Egypt and between Israel and Jordan maybe might see some improvement in light of these agreements that have just recently been signed between Israel, UAE, and Bahrain. I mean, as you know, those are agreements now are decades old between Israel, with Egypt, and with Jordan, but the relationship is very strained between the leadership. The relationship is good, and between the armies, but it's a very cold peace. But do you, to the degree that you're familiar with Egypt and Jordan, can that be turned around by looking at how quickly the peace with Israel was embraced, as you said, by Bahrainis and the Emiratis? Can that rub off somehow on Jordan and Egypt?
Let me comment on that, Alan. In my opinion, in the past few years, the relationship between Israel and Egypt and Jordan are improving, no doubt about that. In my opinion, Sisi, Abdul Fattah al-Sisi, the president of Egypt, almost have his own strategy towards Israel. Abdul Fattah al-Sisi believes that Israel is the strongest in the secret information of security in the Middle East. And the fight these days, by the way, inside Sinai between the Egyptian army and the Islamic terrorists in Sinai, Israel participating, by the way, in bombing in Sinai on the demand of the Egyptians. That's very important. That's very important, because the main job these days is how to fight terrorism. Because unfortunately, terrorism is surrounding us in these days. Now, if we will take Jordan, also the relationship between Jordan and Israel are improving. Don't forget that Israel with the United States are the only two countries who are protecting King Abdullah in Jordan. Israel providing a lot of information on the Jordanian-Syrian border, on the Jordanian-Iraqi border, on the Jordanian-Lebanese border. Israel providing a lot of secret information over there. And that's very important. That's exactly what the king needs. If you need a stable country, you need a strong security. And the only one who can provide the strong security is Israel these days. So sometimes we are hearing, that King Abdullah is upset on Netanyahu, but this is, this is on the table. Look what is going on under the table. It is much more than that. So I can understand, the frustration of King Abdullah from time to time towards Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu. I used to say, Alan, that if we will look to the Middle East map these days and how the Islamic terror is surrounding us, we will find that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is probably the most safe place in the Middle East.
Well, Bassem, we've come to the end of our time here. So I really want to thank you. We could stay online for much longer, but I think we have to end here. Thank you for a fascinating answers and discussion. Thank you very much.